There's a feeling in China that Trump is the best thing ever to happen to China because he's pissed off the Canadians. I'm actually really worried about a deep financial crisis in the United States, depression-like, worse in 2008. When you have 40 trillion US dollars of debt, China started to realize that the rhetoric from Trump and the rhetoric emerging from Western Europe made them realize they had to become more independent.
China is an important trading partner of Iran, with some reports indicating that 70% of Iran's oil exports go to China. So how will China respond to ongoing conflict in the Middle East? What is China's next move? Joining us to discuss China's economy and trade is Shaun Rein, founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group. Welcome to the show, Shaun. Welcome back. Good to see you again. Happy
Chinese New Year, David. I hope the God of money sends you lots of good wealth and good prosperity in 2026. It's been a slightly tough year, as you said, for China. Starting off, you had a lot of their oil has been disappeared essentially by the Americans. So first, by taking Maduro and Venezuela, China lost 2 to 3% of its oil imports, which is where they get from Venezuela. Now with Japan, it's a bigger hit in Iran. 20% of China's oil needs are imported from Iran through the Straits of Hormuz. But here's the thing, David. There's definitely a hit on the consumer here, definitely a hit on manufacturing here because China needs imports of oil. But China over the last 10, 15 years has been trying to lower its dependence and improve its energy security by not buying international oil because they've been investing billions and billions of dollars into solar panel and wind. So for example, China increased about 380 gigahertz of solar technology last year, which is more than the rest of the world combined. China also added, for the 15th straight year in a row, more solar power in the form of wind turbines than the rest of the world, with about 280 gigahertz. So yes, China is going to be hit by the devastation and the tension in the Middle East, but it is going to be hit a lot less than the rest of the world. And one final point on this, David, is that in the United States especially, gas prices move very quickly at the pumps. So they went up 10 to 20%, maybe even more, as the price of oil crossed 100 US dollars a barrel. China tends to raise prices 1 to 2 weeks slower than the rest of the world, and it's more incremental. So they only increase prices by 3% the first week of the tension, and then they only increase it again several percentage points. So while eventually prices will hit consumers, it's not hitting consumers at the pump as fast here as it is in the rest of the world because the Chinese government forces the state-owned enterprises to absorb the profit hit in the short term.
But yeah, that leads to my next question, which is let's talk about the everyday person in China before we get into more of the details of the trade details between Iran and China. How is the average Joe in China reacting to this Iranian conflict? Because on the one hand, like you said, maybe gas prices haven't gone up as much in China as they have in the West. And on the other hand, a big portion of Chinese major cities are now dominated by EVs, right? So how is the average person reacting?
So that's a great point. So the first thing is the price at the pump haven't gone up as much. Second, over 50% of new auto sales in 2025 were NEVs. That's why investors should be looking at NIO. NIO just posted their first profitable quarter of all time. Companies like BYD or Xiaomi, which have been hit hard by weak sales over the last couple months, but we actually think, especially in the case of BYD, that sales are going to go up because they just launched some new models. And last Friday, they just launched new battery technology where they can charge a full car up in about 10 minutes. So I think the tension in the Middle East is going to push the Chinese consumer to adopt NEVs even more. So it's going to be even worse for the Toyotas, the Nissans, the General Motors of the world, who've been really slow at adopting NEV technology. In China, it's really, cars are kind of seen as mobile phones on wheels. They're not really seen as great German or American fine engineering. And so Chinese are saying, with the weak economy, with low income, especially now with the Middle East, let's just buy more NEVs. Now, when it comes to politics, David, it's slightly different. They're actually more optimistic about what's happening in the Middle East. There's a feeling in China that Trump is the best thing ever to happen to China because he's pissed off the Canadians. He's pissed off the British, the French, the Germans. Everybody in the world has gotten angry at Trump. So in the last 3 months since we last spoke, you've seen Keir Starmer, Mark Carney, Macron, Merz from Germany. They've all come almost like beggars in a way to China and saying, we've been bad to you for the last 10 years. We've been part and parcel of Biden and Trump's mechanizations to contain China's growth. But now we realize we're sorry. We need to have good economic relations with you. So even with the Middle East, the Chinese are saying, politically things are looking better now than any time since 2015. So I don't want to say that there's a hockey stick boom of optimism, but there's a slow increase of animal spirits and happiness in the Chinese consumer population because Trump is clearly hurting the United States right now.
Okay, well, let's jump back to geopolitics for a minute. How do you think Iran is asking China, if they have already, to intervene in the war, given that, yes, 20% of China's oil is coming from Iran, but 70% or more of Iran's oil is going to China. So Iran needs China more than China needs Iran. So is Iran asking China for help? And if so, in what form?
So I think when it comes to China, they still take that sovereignty issue and non-interference really importantly. And I think that's key. So people in the United States have criticized China because they didn't come with military aid to Venezuela. They didn't come with military aid to Iran. I think what China wants to do right now is just keep on the economic trade with Iran. They've been a good actor when it comes to militancy by not selling dual-use purpose items and raw weapons to Iran or coming in to invade or to help support in defense systems. So I think what the Chinese are going to do is say, look, we would just want to buy oil. And you've already seen that Iran has said that Chinese ships can go through the Straits of Hormuz unmolested by their weapons. So I don't think you're going to see that China wants to ratchet up its military defense spending or support of Iran, just like they didn't do with the Venezuelans. And here's the thing I think I want to cut through some of the misinformation that comes in the U.S. Two parts of this with that. One is I don't think Iran and China are as close as a lot of Americans think. I don't think there's this access of power that the Bush administration first raised up. I think China basically gets closer to Venezuela, Iran, and especially Russia as a matter of survival. When you wake up and you see the United States putting export restrictions, export controls, when you see Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, saying that China is obviously going to force Russia to bomb NATO countries and China is their biggest threat, and when you see people like Lindsey Graham saying all of the support in Ukraine or support in Iran is aimed at deterring China. China says we don't have friends, so they're being forced to get closer to Iran, forced to get closer to Russia, not out of an access of power, but out of a matter of survivability. When you look at it, David, China's leadership over the last 40 years, none of them sent their kids or grandkids to Russia or the Soviet Union to study. They all went to the United States. Deng Xiaoping's grandkids went to Duke. Hu Yangbang's grandkids went to Yale. Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard. This is a country that loves the United States, David.
Before we continue with the video, I'd like to bring to your attention something that's perhaps even more valuable and important than your investment portfolio, and that's your personal data and your privacy. Now, your personal information is more accessible than you may think, and that's where today's sponsor, Delete Me, comes in. Data brokers and search websites gather and sell details like your name, home address, phone number, and even family connections, sometimes without you even realizing it. Delete Me is a service I use to help me limit that exposure. Setup takes only a few minutes, and after that, their team handles everything. They identify where your information appears, confirm those listings, and submit removal requests to hundreds of data broker websites. They also continue monitoring over time since this data can reappear. I've been personally using it for over a year now, and they've reviewed over 325 listings for my information. The reports show exactly what was found and what was removed, which makes the process transparent. If you want to check it out, go to joindeleteme.com/DavidLin, link in the description down below, or scan the QR code here to get started. Use my code DavidLin for 20% off. Get started and protect your privacy today.
Well, speaking of this viewpoint that Iran matters a lot for China, here's an article from The Diplomat, and I'll just read to you this paragraph. It's titled, "The Decapitation of Iran, What Tehran's Chaos Means for China." Let's evaluate this particular paragraph together, Shaun. For Beijing, this is a catastrophic geoeconomic earthquake. China's entire Middle Eastern architecture has just suffered a fatal blow. As the shockwaves radiate from Tehran, Beijing faces the immediate fracturing of its energy security, the collapse of its defense exports, and the rupture of its Belt and Road Initiative. Can you just evaluate that statement?
Yeah, I think that's exaggeration from The Diplomat, which I don't typically take too seriously as a magazine for really understanding China. So obviously, Iran hits the energy security, as we've talked about. Yeah. It obviously hits some Belt and Road, but actually China's doing a lot more business with Saudi Arabia right now in non-oil related fields. When you go to Saudi Arabia, I was just there, you see huge Huawei, Alibaba signs and investments all over the place. You're actually seeing it all over the Middle East and Africa. In the last few months, I've been all over Africa, and you see that China is moving quickly with tech investments, acquisitions of mines like chrome ore in South Africa, copper in the DNC. So I think The Diplomat is right to say that there's some tension and that there's issues, but I think they're exaggerating the real hit to China. China's focused now more on increasing its energy independence by wrapping up nuclear, solar, and wind turbines.
And this partnership with Saudi Arabia you're talking about, this falls into the larger umbrella of China diversifying its business ties away from just one source to many places around the world, which you spoke about earlier in the interview. Tell us about this grander diversification effort that started years ago. What's China's grand vision here?
Well, I think, China was really trying to get close to the hip of the United States. And I remember when Obama won the presidency, there was this huge euphoria amongst the senior leadership in China. They thought, wow, we now have a man who is not a warmonger, somebody who's not white, who might be willing to do more business deals and more political deals with yellow people. And so they were really happy when Obama came up. But they found that he wasn't warm enough. And so by the end of 8 years, they were a little disappointed. They didn't think he was evil, but they had hoped that China would get closer to the United States at the time. Yeah. So when Trump emerged in 2016 and launched the trade war, which was, remember, was about reciprocity. It was about intellectual property rights. It was not about the national security that had started to emerge under the lexicon and talking points of Joe Biden. It was more about fair access to market, which I actually agreed with. But here's the thing, David. In 2016, China started to realize that the rhetoric from Trump and the rhetoric emerging from Western Europe made them realize they had to become more independent. So they spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the last decade, focused not just on energy independence, which we've talked about, but they also looked at technology, which is why China has spent a lot on indigenous innovation in semiconductors and AI, which is why we're very bullish on the Chinese semiconductor companies. And this is why the Chinese aren't buying NVIDIA's H200 chips, because they don't need it. They already have great chips from Huawei and Manus and some of these other Chinese companies. But also third, which people don't realize, is China went independent on food security. So now instead of needing to buy as much beef, as much blueberries from Australia or Brazil, they have huge cattle farms in Shandong province and coffee and fruits in Yunnan province. So across the board, David, China is saying we're getting a Cold War 2.0. We need to focus on independence for literally every single sector, which is why as an investor, I'm bullish on Chinese companies, less optimistic on the ability for foreign companies to actually sell to Chinese, because the Chinese are not going to buy the beef or the blueberries like they might have 10 years ago, because it's all now being grown or raised in China.
Speaking of oil sources, is China still the largest buyer of Russian oil? And if so, how do you think the flow of Russian oil is going to change now that Iran is cut off as a supplier?
So China is probably the biggest buyer of Russian oil because they have ignored the sanctions from Trump and they're willing to buy Russian oil. But I think, David, what's more interesting is what's happening with India, right? India was the largest buyer of Russian oil 6 months ago. You know, India, I think, actually has a closer friendship with Russia over 50 years than the Chinese have. And then all of a sudden, the Americans put, 48%, 50% tariff on Russian imports, Indian imports. They've also really pressed Modi. And so Modi gave in and backed down and said, fine, we're not going to buy any more Russian oil. And then now they've gotten a 30-day exemption and they're able to buy Russian oil again. But the Russians, to their credit, are selling, but they're angry at India. So they're actually selling it at a global premium. And there's nothing that India can do. I think Modi is showing himself to be an extremely weak power if he wants India to be a major superpower, which I think it should and will become the next years. I think the problem with Modi is showing himself a vassal to the United States. He's not a close friend with the Russians, who've been close to them for 50 years, even longer, actually. And he's not particularly close to the Chinese. So people talk about China isolating themselves. I don't see that. I see India starting to isolate themselves from the big powers. And it's Modi and I think poor political decision-making that could stop India from becoming the superpower that it should become.
So let's look farther ahead now. China's economy to overtake the USA by 2030. This is a prediction market on Kalshi, 22.5% chance. That seems a bit low. What do you think? What do you place the odds?
Well, I think it's higher right now, but I mean, things change fast. I'm actually really worried about a deep financial crisis in the United States, depression like worse in 2008, when you have 40 trillion US dollars of debt, when you have a country that has destroyed its relationships with even such a close ally as Canada. I mean, what did Canada ever do to the United States except for being a best friend? When you have a person, and I don't say this to joke, I don't say this to be mean, because I am not anti-Trump historically, but I think he's gone mentally ill over the last 6 months. I think dementia has started to overtake some of his thinking processes, so he's not thinking clearly and smartly or pragmatically about international relations. So when you have debt, when you have angering of allies, and you have a president who's not thinking clearly, that's when you get the situation that could be devastating for the American economy. I'm quite concerned what you're seeing in the private credit markets. I'm quite concerned what you're seeing in the labor markets, that if there is a drop of 10, 20% in the equity markets, I'm not sure that we have the leadership or the ability to get out of it unscathed. So I'm really concerned in 2026, 2027 about a deep financial crisis. If that happens, then yes, I could see China emerging as the largest economy over the next 5 to 10 years. But that's more if there's not because of China's growth up, but more because of an implosion economically and politically in the United States. There's things aren't right in DC right now. It just doesn't make any sense about some of the actions that Trump's doing. I don't think Trump in 2016 would have gone after Iran like he did in 2026. There's something wrong with him, and there's something wrong with his advisors around him who are more like sycophants than long-term thinking. I mean, you've seen some of the heads of the military in that region resigned or were fired a week before the acts of aggression by the Americans. There's clearly something not right. It doesn't smell right in Denmark, America.
Yeah,
the Kingdom of Denmark.
Yeah, the
trying to do some
separate.
Shakespeare illusion.
Okay, all right.
Didn't go very well,
thank you
David.
for
It's
clarifying.
early morning in
Yeah.
Shanghai. It's 6 a.m. my time, and I'm jet lagged from Africa. I just got back.
You're still lucid at the 6 a.m. We appreciate that. But going back to the Chinese economy. Okay, so Great Depression first of all, if the U.S. economy falls into a Great Depression or some sort of economic recession, maybe not even a depression, how does China's economy react? Is there a direct impact?
China will hurt. Obviously, China will hurt, but I think they're better able to handle a depression or recession in the United States. So some numbers, right? In 2017, 14.5% of China's exports went to the United States. That number is down to only around 11% now, again, because China has been de-risking its export supply chain. They now export 18% to Southeast Asia. That's one. Second, China is making major moves for the RMB to become a reserve currency. Now, a lot of people joke about it and say the RMB is not convertible, but right now about 40% of cross-border trade with China is actually conducted in the RMB. So a lot of countries, to offset the risk of a plummeting US dollar, are willing to put RMB in their reserves, and a lot of companies are willing to do the same thing. So third, and I think this is important since this is more of an investing show, I have been talking with mutual funds and hedge funds in the last 6 to 9 months. They missed out on the major boom of the equity rise in 2024. They missed out largely in 2025. Some of the biggies are saying, you know what? With Trump and the geopolitical tension there, maybe it's time to get exposure to the Hong Kong and the Chinese equity markets again. And so I was actually talking with an investment banker from Hong Kong recently who told me that his commissions from his bank have doubled in the last 3 months in Hong Kong over the previous years because so many international institutional investors are moving out of Japan, moving out of Korea, moving out of the United States and going back into China. So if there's a depression in the United States, obviously China is going to be hit hard, but they're going to be hit less hard than the rest of the world because of their de-risking strategy and the internationalization of the RMB. I'm actually quite optimistic for the Chinese equity markets over the next 1 to 2 year periods. And
speaking of sectors within the Chinese equity markets, Reuters is reporting that Chinese state banks are now flooding AI and advanced manufacturers with new loans. Take a look at this headline. Chinese banks boost loans to tech sector as Beijing ramps up AI push. Chinese lenders plan to steer more money toward technology and innovation-oriented firms. The credit allocation shift toward tech is well underway. How do recent developments, especially this headline, change your view on Chinese tech companies, especially semiconductors?
Well, I've been bullish, as you read in my book, The Split, which I wrote a couple years ago. I said that investors should buy Chinese semiconductor and AI companies, and I was right. They're booming right now. There's a lot of optimism in the space. And I think importantly, David, there's optimism because it's not just the Chinese market that they're selling into. As I said, when I was in Saudi Arabia, I saw Alibaba and Huawei signs everywhere. You go into Cape Town, you go into Jakarta, all these I've been into recently. In the airports, it's all Huawei signs. Now, the reason is because the global South, I prefer to call it the global majority, is worried about getting sanctioned too by the Americans. And so they don't want to be technological vassals to America where they're forced to buy NVIDIA chips, where they're forced to use Claude or ChatGPT from OpenAI. They've seen what Biden and Trump have both done to China when it comes to technology containment. And so they're saying, you know what? For the betterment of our countries, we also need to buy Chinese technology. And that's why I think these Chinese technology players are going to continue to grow over the next 10, 20 years. I'll give an example. Malaysia spent billions of dollars, I think about $5 billion. They wanted to be a major data house center for AI. In the last week of Biden's administration or regime, he banned the export of high-end NVIDIA chips to Malaysia, putting a kebab in Malaysia's long-term plans, dreams about becoming a data center for the world in AI. So Malaysia got screwed. So they immediately announced they were going to buy Huawei chips. And I think, David, America's bullying and oppression of the global majority is going to come back to haunt them. It's shooting themselves in the foot. Because now all of these other countries, and I think including Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, are going to say, we need Chinese chips. We need Chinese AI, especially the AI because it's open source and free. So the excitement here around in 2026 is the AI and semiconductor sector.
Okay. Finally, before we go, I want you to please address these concerns coming out of the blogosphere about Taiwan now being more of a risk or more at risk after the Iranian attacks, or attack on Iran, rather. Does Iran war make a China attack on Taiwan more likely? This is from Asia Times. Time magazine has a different spin on it. But I'll just read you this paragraph from Time. Will she be tempted to take advantage of U.S. potentially exhausting smart munitions and attack Taiwan, even if the PLA is not fully ready? Asked Professor Steve Tsang, director of the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. Possible, he says. What's your view on this?
So, David, for 20 years, every 6 to 12 months, I make a lot of money because hedge funds hire me for a call to ask, is China about to invade? So this is something that we hear all the time. You know, at the height of COVID, China was going to invade Taiwan because they needed to distract the Chinese population from COVID restrictions and from the weak economy. Now, here's my take on it. In the short term, no, because 7 of the 9 members of the Central Military Commission have been arrested or detained, publicly investigated for corruption or something else. We don't know what the full allegations are. So the entire leadership in the military right now is not ready for a land invasion of Taiwan. That's number one. Number two, you know, as you've seen, America, even though America has all the firepower, we keep losing. Right? We lost to the Taliban. You know, I wouldn't say that we have a win in Iran, even though America and Trump is saying that. We still have a closed Strait of Hormuz. So it's a lot harder to invade an island and control it than people think. And I think the Chinese are smart. They don't want to do that. Third, the Chinese are not warmongers. If they were going to invade, it would have been smart to invade literally yesterday, right? Because the United States is spending all of its focus on the Middle East. They've removed the THAAD missiles from South Korea, and they're moving it to the Middle East. So that area doesn't have the THAAD missiles anymore. China's not going to do that. They are not militant. They view the Taiwanese as cousins. I think you and I have talked about it. China wants to go slowly. They definitely want to reunify. That's a red line under Chinese government policy. But they want to do it like they did with Hong Kong. They don't want to have death. They don't want to have destruction. China, I think, respects life a lot more than the United States does, frankly. You know, America can bomb the Ayatollah and they say 160 schoolgirls were killed. That's just collateral damage. Trump doesn't even apologize. I don't think Xi Jinping wants to kill Taiwanese. What you've seen importantly is in the last few months, the vice chairman of the Kuomintang, or the KMT, the opposition party in Taiwan, has visited China, been treated like a hero. You and I have talked about this in past. President Ma, the former president of Taiwan, who's from the Kuomintang, he has actually visited China and met with the President Xi and treated like a hero. And the new chairwoman of the KMT has said she would like to come to China soon and meet with Xi. So I think you're seeing the long-term planning of wanting to have peaceful, better relations and integration if the KMT win in the next presidential election. And I think you just have the realistic day-to-day realities that the leadership of China's military is in disarray with all of the corruption or whatever the issues were that took out the Central Military Commission and several ministers of defense in a row. I don't think that there's going to be action in the next 3 to 6 months by any means, no matter how wrapped up Trump gets in the Middle East. I think Xi Jinping is going to say, sit, do nothing, and win.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Shaun. Tell us where we can find your work and follow you.
Thanks so much for having me, David. Like always, I'm available on LinkedIn and Twitter, but the best thing to do is to read my book, The Split, Finding the Opportunities in China and the New World Order. It came out a year ago, but if you look at the mapping, it said exactly right where to invest. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And we'll put the links down below, so make sure to follow Shaun there. Thank you again, Shaun. We'll speak next time, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.